evening. We actually having a very interesting week. This whole year, 2020, is unreal in so many ways, full of all sorts of surprises. Just yesterday, I was giving a lecture on what happens in Belarus. Even though I'm not from Belarus, but I feel I simply could not, stop thinking about what's happening there for a few days, and I had to connect it with the Torah. Because at the end of the day, we just believe that we can find answers to different questions in the Torah. That's how we study Torah. It's meant to be addressing questions of today, not just what happened in the past, and not just giving us general guidelines, but also help us address what's happening in the world around us. So I'd like to start, even though today we're talking about a different topic. We're talking about something which I think is very positive. First of all, I'd like to start with a short prayer for the well-being of all the people in Belarus. People are suffering today tremendously, and I'm sure you are already aware of this, and you've seen some pictures, images from there, very disturbing. And I gave a lecture about it yesterday. I'm gonna repeat what I said. If you're interested, you can take a look on my Facebook page. But I really want to wish peace and prosperity to people of Belarus who are struggling for their freedom right now. And also I'd like to say, may Hashem help those people who are on the other side, some of them, to open their eyes and finally stop fighting against their own people. That's as far as Belarus is concerned. Today we have another day of dramatic news that literally, I think, for me personally, this wasn't such a huge sensation, but I think it was a great sensation and a great shock for many people around. The news were announced about the agreements, the normalization, so-called normalization between United Arab Emirates, which of course, as you know, is a prosperous country, one of the most prosperous countries in the Arab world, if not the most prosperous country in the Arab world, and Israel. And this was announced by Israeli Prime Minister, by Trump, and this was also circulated as some of the Israeli leaders, including the head of one of the heads of the Israeli government, that's Benny Gantz. Israel is now having a coalition government, was taken by surprise. It was not informed. We know that. And not only he was not informed, world leaders were not informed, and Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas was not informed and was taken aback by this. I'd like to start with taking a look at what's happening and a little analysis. We live in a very fast-moving world. This happened just today. We already have some news coverage of the event. I will take a look at the news coverage from different newspapers, a little bit what I've seen, and I try to give, in the second part of my presentation, to give it some Torah perspective. Again, this is very fresh. As you realize, it just happened today. And I'm never pretending, this is my little disclaimer, I'm never pretending to be in any way a prophet or somebody who's in the know or somebody who can claim that his interpretation is the Torah true interpretation. Certainly not. You're welcome to challenge what I'm saying. I'm just inviting you to think out loud with me together, and I'm going to present to you my understanding of the current events, or what's happening today, looking at the Torah for some answers and for some, hopefully, inspiration and some sense of direction and guidance in what's happening. So I decided to call this lecture in a little bit provocative name. I gave it a provocative name, the New Middle East. If you're aware why this name is provocative, you know something about the history of the Middle Eastern conflict. The New Middle East was the vision originally of Shimon Peres, and what's happening today, what's emerging today, is a very different New Middle East, very different to the one that Shimon Peres saw. In some way, the way to accomplish it, according to Shimon Peres, would have been very different. However, we actually coming, it seems, to a new era of peace in the Middle East. At least I don't think it's a minor agreement. I think it's quite a major step, what's happening today. And we're going to see the reaction in the world and the reaction in Israel to this is, as predicted, is certainly multifaceted. And you have people on both right and left basically not happy with the agreements, we're going to see why, and we'll try to understand why this agreement is important, what's been accomplished already, what's going to be accomplished soon, and how this is going to change the world and the Middle East. First of all, the Middle East, but also the world in many ways. We're talking about a conflict that is being going on for a long, long time. On my channel, I have a series of lectures about the history of Jerusalem with a professor of history in Moscow University. He was a co-author of the book on diplomatic battle over Jerusalem. If interested, you can take a look on my YouTube channel. It's been a fascinating and interesting discussion in order to understand what's happening and what kind of mess is the Middle East. It's good to know some history. It didn't start yesterday. It didn't start 10 years ago. It didn't start with Oslo. It didn't start with what was going on with PLO, where PLO just appeared on the map after Palestinian Liberation Organization, that is, after a 6-day war. It didn't start with all the wars between us and Arabs. It potentially originated as a modern conflict between two nationalisms in a period of the British Mandate. We can actually look there and see what's happening. But we don't have time for that right now. We really try to focus on this particular agreement, which I think is a milestone, which was signed today between United Arab Emirates and Israel. And of course, Kushner played a very important role in that, as we can understand, I can imagine. He is the shadow architect of the peace plan, the Trump Peace Initiative. Let's take a look. First of all, those with us on Zoom are going to see some content I'm going to share from today's coverage of different newspapers. Those of us on Facebook, I will describe what's happening. I'll do my best to describe what's happening. And I hope I'm going to be clear even without you seeing the images. So let's start first of all from the tweet message on the Twitter. Official Israeli Foreign Ministry, Misrad HaChutz Israeli, comes with the following message on Twitter. That's of course today. PM Netanyahu on the establishment of full and formal ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Today we usher in a new era of peace between Israel and the Arab world. Among the steps included a mutual opening of embassies, direct flights, and other bilateral agreements. Of course, Israelis are very happy about being able to fly to Dubai finally. It may not appear to be the greatest incentive, but Israelis are very adventurous people, as you know that. So I think that part of the agreement nobody disagrees with. We're going to take a look a little later at what exactly is the problem of Israeli rights. And let me tell you this, on my friend list, you know, on Facebook, of course, I have plenty of right-wingers, as you can imagine, and some of them, many of them actually, are very displeased with what appears to be a very good agreement. So we'll take a look, what's the problem. Next is this headline from Jerusalem Post. Israel, UAE, reach historic peace deal. We can make a wonderful future. Okay, sounds like a optimistic headline there. And you know, of course, that looking at the source of the news would make a major difference. We know Jerusalem Post is somewhat center-right. So it's more or less optimistic about this. Here we have Palestinian president fumes after Israel Emirates normalization deal, written by Barak Ravid. Of course he does. He wasn't even informed. And we're going to see some analysis a little later, what exactly makes him so displeased about this agreement. And this one is coming from an Israeli newspaper, a very left-leaning Israeli newspaper. As you can imagine, looking at the headline, this of course is Haaretz. Analysis. Israel UAE deal clears annexation model, but not for everyone. In other words, the only good thing from Haaretz's point of view is that this agreement was signed and it was announced that Israel will postpone what was being announced coming up very soon. You know, Bibi Netanyahu was actually making this promise before elections. This is going to announce sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. This is going to be postponed now. And Bibi says it's not going to be put in somewhere in a box forever. It's certainly going to happen, but many people on the right are not happy about it. So Haaretz is very happy about that part. Haaretz says it clears annexation model, but not for everyone. Apparently, it's not good enough for Palestinians, as Netanyahu loads historic agreement in Haaretz. It appears, of course, in quotation marks, historic agreement. The UAE gets international applause, but of course, the Palestinians are left out. They are left out. So, okay, fine, that's Haaretz. You wouldn't expect any better from Haaretz, of course, right? But here comes another left-leaning newspaper from England, Guardian, and I actually would like to take some time to analyze this very good piece from Guardian. You know, Guardian is left-leaning, but Guardian, I think, is well known for its good quality of journalism. And I would specifically take a look at this piece coming from Guardian today, 4/4, shared interests that make UAE a friend of Israel. A friend, again, is quotation marks, but let's take a look at what Guardian has to say about this. Some people don't like the fact that, you know, I read all sorts of publications left and right. You know what? Sometimes it's good to be informed, and good information is coming from analyzing data from all sorts of places, be it left or right. And I personally think that this particular piece in The Guardian actually sheds some light on what's going on. So let's take a look. I think it's good journalism. We may disagree with some of the perspectives, but overall, I think it's a good journalism. It's good analysis. So here comes Guardian. And I'm not going to quote the whole article. I will just share with you some of the most important key positions of what they're saying, and I will try to give it some analysis. And then later on, what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at the Torah perspective of it, look on it, looking, of course, into our portion, into our Torah portion for some guidance. So here we have The Guardian. More than anything else, it speaks of the fact that 4/4, right? We have a common foe, us and Arabs. And of course, this is combating Iran. That's the main reason, right, of what's going on in here, of the closer relationship between us and the Arab world, between Israel and the Arabs. Tehran's determination to acquire a nuclear weapon, its extensive reach into the Arab world, potential to shut off the Strait of Hormuz, etc., etc., etc. We all know that. We understand the idea. So now we have some partnership going on between the Arabs and Israel based on a common threat coming from Iran. So now what happens is trust grew in these years since Trump took power, and as faith in the Palestinians waned. And that's another important aspect of what's happening. Faith in the Palestinians waned in the Arab world, particularly in Abu Dhabi, where Israeli claims that the bedrock approach of land for peace was broken, had won resonance. For those who are not familiar, up until now, we always had this scenario of so-called two-state solution between us and Palestinians, and all the peace deals we had so far brokered with the Arabs, they always were based on this premise that we need to give up some territories in order to get peace, in order to get a peace agreement. We had one with Egypt. We have to give up the entire Sinai Peninsula for that. We had one with Jordanians, and that one actually didn't cause much territorial loss, but Jordanians were insisting on us going back to the international borders with Palestinians and insisting on a few other things that came in that agreement. So here we have a bit of a paradigm shift. We'll talk a little bit later about the paradigm shift that happens now in this whole approach to the Middle East. That's very important to understand. So as a result of this common threat, common fear between us and the Arabs of Tehran and Iran, Iranian nuclear threat and conventional weapons threat, this bedrock approach of land for peace is now broken. And the Arabs all of a sudden are willing to take a different approach. A two-state solution, which was the mantra, it was an underwritten, had underwritten a collective Arab approach to peace. That's what the author here says, and that's true. Arabs were constantly thinking in terms of so-called two-state solution. It had been eclipsed by more pressing realities. So now it's changing, it's different. And then, of course, certain steps that this administration takes. And that's important to understand because we have many critics on the right are saying Bibi was supposed to do what he promised us. He was running to win the elections, making a promise that there's going to be sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. Now it's going to be postponed as a result of this agreement, as a result of this peace deal with the Emirates. Let's take a look what's been accomplished since Trump took office as far as Israel is concerned. So we have a whole list in here. That the warming ties were taking place as the Trump administration shredded conventions on Israel-Palestine did not seem to matter. I would actually disagree with that particular did not seem to matter. I would say Trump actually plays a very proactive and important role in warming up. But of course, the author's political agenda here is clear. Anyhow, important steps been taken. What are they? Moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, check. This has been, of course, an issue that many American administrations could have been doing this earlier, and they were all basically paying lip service to the idea that Jerusalem is the united and divided capital of Israel, making promises that eventually they will move the capital. It never happened. Trump did it. Slashing U.S. funding for Palestinian refugees, check. We got that one too. Annexing the Syrian Golan Heights, expanding settlements, closing the Palestinian embassy to Washington. Relationship between Palestinians and this U.S. administration, as we know, very lukewarm. And introducing a peace plan that ignored nearly every premise of earlier approaches were all set aside. So this peace deal, the Trump peace deal, is a new way of looking at what's happening. It's a totally new perspective, and we're going to see how so. Arab solidarity on Palestine had clearly splintered by the time Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, rolled out his version of a solution. So now we have different approach to deal breaking. That plan gave Israel a lot of what it sought and diminished Palestinian aspirations. And as a result, Mahmoud Abbas turned up his nose and had boycotted Trump ever since. But here comes the new perspective on things. We've seen up until now, the understanding being that we need to make it work between Israel and the Palestinians. However, this is a conflict between Israel and the Arab world, not just Israel and Palestinians. If you take a look at Palestinian national identity, it's a pretty recent thing. But the conflict with the Arabs is being there since the British Mandate period. And we do have Arab nationalist movement that never called itself Palestinian. And we have the Arab world clearly standing on desire basically to eliminate Israel. This was not limited to Palestinians. This was, of course, a big deal for the whole Arab world. We can remember 1948 when Arabs from different countries were joining the independence war, or we call independence war. From their perspective, this was the war of extermination. They wanted to finish us off in 1948. Same thing happened after we won 1967, 1973. There was an embargo. Arabs never recognized there's going to be some sort of peace between us and them. They never came to that recognition. They never agreed on any sort of a compromise with us. And as I said, a separate peace that was made with Egypt cost us the entire territory of the Sinai Peninsula. This was done, by the way, by the right-wing administration of Menachem Begin, and yet it set a very sad, in a very sad way I'd say this, but it said certainly this practical realization of land for peace. We only take peace and they take land. They take pieces from us, right? And in case of the agreement with Egypt, they took it all. They took it all. They took all of the Sinai. So let's see what happens now. let's see what happens now and how this is radically different. Current solution, current plan, the peace plan of Trump is giving us basically, and we're not looking at the maps. I have a lecture on the peace plan when the proposal came, and you can take a look at my YouTube channel. I have a lecture on this. Basically, it gives us what we have now as Zone C pretty much entirely, which is where Israeli settlements are. And we can technically announce, based on this plan, announce our sovereignty over there. And Palestinian state is going to be dissected, and it's going to be an enclave within Israeli territory, demilitarized. And so basically, it is de facto an autonomy, not a real independent state. And there are many factors that are to be determined before Palestinians would even get that. Of course, they need to combat terrorism, they need to be demilitarized, they need to fully recognize Israel, and so on and so forth. So how all of a sudden it was such a huge surprise for so many today that this peace agreement between Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates, very wealthy country, and Israel happened. So in a few days, it's going to be an exchange of ambassadors, full diplomatic relationship, and Israelis will be able to travel to Abu Dhabi or Dubai, and people from the Emirates will be able to visit the Temple Mount, will be able to come here to Israel on pilgrimage. What happened? So, based on this article from The Guardian, we understand that maybe it's not necessarily goodwill of the Arabs to all of a sudden make a peace deal with Israel by itself. We have strategic considerations. We have threat coming from Iran. We mentioned that already. And we have certain disillusionment with Palestinian agenda. And Palestinian agenda becomes much less important now. It's been failing and failing and failing. And also don't forget that these countries are pumping a lot of money into PA, and they never saw thank you. They always hear complaints. So that possibly was also a factor. Now, look at what this author of this editorial in The Guardian does. He says, he actually considers this an important agreement. Some people here in America, of course, because it's been accomplished by Trump, nothing good can come from Trump. And same thing, by the way, with Israeli left, nothing good possibly can come from Bibi. You see people on the left, if they would have accomplished peace deal with such an important country as Arab Emirates, they probably would have been totally delighted, and they would be considering themselves making a huge historic accomplishment. Yet now they are complaining basically just because it's coming from Bibi. That's the main complaint. But let's take a look historically what's happening now. So the author of this article makes the following claim. It says, only several events have had the same impetus for Israel since its declaration of independence in 1948. Of course, from the left-wing perspective, it's primarily the peace agreements, but to be honest, even for people on the right, for most Israelis, peace deal between us and the Arabs is an important, very important thing. The question, of course, is how are we going to accomplish it? And we'll come back later to understand how different this peace initiative and how different what's happening now in the Middle East is a total paradigm shift to what we've seen until now. But he mentions here 78 Camp David agreement, that's between us and Egypt, of course, the pact with Jordan, signed 17 years later, and the Oslo Accords of 93. Oslo Accords being a major failure, which he fails to recognize. Of course, he is coming from a very left-wing perspective. And yet it says, and now this is an important agreement, and as opposed to what happened at Oslo, where we were basically moving towards a two-state solution. And we were militarizing and giving an opportunity to Palestinians basically to build their national institutions very much at cost of regional peace, because we know there were intifadas, there were many Israelis killed. Palestinian police, semi-military police, was very often involved in all sorts of, attacks on Israelis. So We've seen all of that. And finally, in Israel, you have total disillusionment with Oslo Accords. And you have a disillusionment with a two-state solution that it can even work. Now watch this. Two-state solution, up until Trump, was still a mantra in the minds of Europeans and even Americans. Each and every American administration insisted on a two-state solution. This was the case with European politicians. It is still, to a large extent, the case with them. It's an old paradigm that is still there. However, the Arabs now are the ones to break this paradigm. And they're the ones to go ahead with us and to create this huge paradigm shift. And that's what it says. The impact is just as significant for the Palestinians who are now confronting a paradigm shift that leads them further away than ever from self-determination. The splintered diaspora is ever more entrenched across Salus and a shrinking West Bank, and so on and so forth. So this is, if you take a look at this agreement from Palestinian point of view, is not a good agreement because apparently it makes them much weaker. That's the perspective of a left-wing Guardian newspaper. But we take from here what's important for us. Emirates-led position on a peace deal is unlikely to leave it isolated for long. Here comes another very important consideration. It's not just us and the Emirates. It's not just us and the Emirates. Few more countries in the Gulf are going to join them soon. And that's pretty evident. We already saw some hints coming up in the news. Bibi already spoke about it, and we understand it's basically in the making. It's a rare diplomatic win for Trump, being recognized by the Guardian. That's a big one, right? So-called GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council states, are going to follow. Bahrain and Oman being likely candidates, and possibly even the regional heavyweight, that's of course Saudi Arabia. As quite serious possibility that Saudis are going to join Israel, are going to join Emirates and other countries of the Gulf in signing peace agreement with Israel. That's of course a very, very important milestone. You understand it's a total paradigm shift. And we're going to talk about how this paradigm shift is important and what are the aspects of this paradigm shift very soon. Let's start with this. The two-state solution was barely kicking when Trump took office. It is flatlining now. While Israel celebrates, Palestinians are facing one of their most bitter reckonings. They will have to reckon with a new geographic reality, a new geopolitical reality, in which Arab countries, their sponsors, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, their sponsors are going to push them very hard to come back to the negotiations table, and the conditions of those negotiations are going to be very different. They're going to be based on the Trump Peace Initiative. And I'm not talking about Trump Peace Initiative specifically right now. I want to point out the major differences between what's happening in this peace deal between us and the Emirates, as opposed to the former peace agreements that we had. So number one, we already established that we are done with this premise. That was the premise of previous negotiations, that peace that we have been gaining apparently from the Arab country that makes a peace deal with us comes at the cost of some territorial loss. That is a major difference, number one. Number two, Arabs insisted for a very long time there can be no regional peace unless there is a certain very important concession we make to Palestinians. We move back to 1967 borders. This was actually a recent proposal of the Saudis before the Trump plan. And certainly beforehand, Arabs would not even consider any peace agreement with us to begin with. Even on Oslo terms, nothing of the regional peace would have been accomplished because they started the other way around. The idea was that first we make peace with Palestinians, and then eventually the other Arab countries will join. So let us take a look again back in history. And remember, before the term Palestinian even appeared, we already have disagreements with the Arab world. It was a clash of two nationalisms. Us, Zionism, building ourselves in the land of Israel, and the Arab nationalism that was also growing in the 20s and 30s in then British mandate Palestine. The word Palestinian, if it appeared then, was only in reference to the Jews, was never in reference to the Arabs. It only became a brand name for local Arabs much later. And PLO is a product of KGB, as we know, and it came into being after 6-Day War, as we know. So instead of trying to make something impossible, peace between us and Palestinians, we are actually moving back to something that appeared to be a dream, appeared to be unfathomable, because how can we ever make peace with the whole Arab world? Is it even possible? But here we come to a new reality of a new Middle East, where Trump administration, which is very pragmatic and very businesslike, Kushner, who seems to be a very good deal maker, and Bibi, who has been having a vision of this original agreement for a long time already. If you take a look at Bibi's writings from 20 years ago, his strategic understanding of how we're going to be able to broker some peace, he was insisting that we need to make some regional deal, and only then this would push some sort of a agreement between us and Palestinians. So it's a major, major accomplishment, I think, and it's a major paradigm shift. So what makes people on the right in Israel so unhappy about this agreement? Many people on the right are quite unhappy, and I understand why they are unhappy. Because if you take a look at what happens right now, it appears Bibi promised something that is not going to fulfill. Some people said basically, well, it's a total lie. He just did this again, very opportunistic. He simply made a promise and he never intended to fulfill it. Made a promise before elections, and some people voted for him because of this, that there's going to be sovereignty over Judea and Samaria based on the Trump plan, the Area C, where we have our settlements, and it's going to be annexation of the Jordan Valley, very important for us strategically, geographically, politically, you name it. Okay, so that seems to be a good argument. That seems to be a valid argument. And I said, of course, people on the left are very unhappy for a good reason too. Maybe they should be unhappy. They were dreaming about this two-state solution, which is now totally dead. And of course, Palestinians will have to face a very harsh and bitter reality. Don't forget that they were offered by Olmert, by Barak, pretty much all the entire what was supposed to be territory of the Arab state based on 1948 agreements. Almost the entire territory was offered to them, including Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, including on the Olmert plan, the old city. People don't know that maybe, or maybe they forgot, but this was basically what we were talking about. So some meters were not there, and Arafat first didn't like the agreement, and then, of course, the next generation of the Arab leaders rejected the agreement with Olmert. So all of that was rejected with Barak and with Olmert. And what are we offering them now? Well, actually, we're not offering them anything at the moment. The thing is, we first of all coming to a regional peace agreement between us and the Arabs. And the next step would be, most likely, which I think is going to happen, a change of leadership in the Palestinian Authority. A pragmatic leadership would have to come, because they're going to be running out of money. They're going to be running out of money. These Arab countries that are going to make peace agreement with us are going to put a tremendous pressure on them. And of course, they will come to a point of total collapse unless the new leadership, which is going to be able to think in more pragmatic terms, will come and appear there. Either case scenario appears to be a major change for us. But let's take a look again at the argument of the right. And I specifically want to address this because I have many friends on the right who are very critical of this agreement. And I think it's important, by the way, in a democratic country like Israel, there should be criticism, and it's a good thing. But at the same time, I think if we take a look at what's happening now and make some parallels from how Israel grew and developed and what happened all the way back from 1948, we're going to see something very interesting, in my opinion. Basically, we have two approaches to what's happening. in any sort of negotiations, we have one approach which we can call pragmatic approach, which is basically saying, okay, let's take a look at it. And the other approach which says all or nothing. If you notice, Palestinians always took that second approach, all or nothing. And there's a famous phrase that their leadership would never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, right? It's always been the case. So we were trying to somehow, especially the left, but to a large extent also in our further negotiations, a very dangerous precedent was set between us and Egypt when Begin agreed to give up the entire territory of the Sinai, right? So land for peace. So we had this understanding somehow that, okay, so Arabs who have in such a strong position, we are going to come to all sorts of compromises with Palestinians and eventually, but there was no eventually because they would make zero compromises. And that's how they failed and nothing happened. So ironically, we do have some people on our political right who also say all or nothing. And basically they say, if we're not getting peace accord or peace agreement or that Trump is suggesting, peace plan of Trump is not good enough because it doesn't give us the entire territory of Judea and Samaria. And I can hear that. However, if you take a look back at 1948, when the United Nations in 1947 was coming up with a partition plan for Palestine, as you know, it wasn't necessarily a very favorable plan for us. We managed to get Negev into our hands as opposed to what was proposed by the British on the Pyle Commission. So that was, of course, a significant improvement, but yet we were giving up an entire chunk of territory of Judea and Samaria. As you know, Jerusalem was divided under this agreement and it remained divided until 1967. And yet Arabs, of course, rejected this agreement and the Jewish leadership decided to go with it. Borders of Israel of 1948 were called Auschwitz borders. They virtually impossible to defend. We know that. And yet Israel decided to take a pragmatic approach. And Ben-Gurion, I think, in that sense, was doing the right thing. He was thinking ahead. He said, okay, now the question is, are we going to establish a state now or not? It's actually this question that allowed him and other Israeli politicians at the time to accept a very difficult partition plan. And eventually we did create a state, and Palestinians never did. They never did because they never were thinking in terms of geopolitical reality that they are dealing with. They always were living in a fantasy world that they will be able somehow to get rid of the Jews and to take the entire territory for themselves. So I think idealism is a very important and necessary thing, and we have a lot of it on the right, and it's good and it's great. At the same time, I think what we're facing right now is this game is happening in a few stages. If we take a look at it from a more spiritual perspective, Talmud speaks about the days of Mashiach, the Messianic times, and gives us two scenarios. And both scenarios are very radical. One scenario is it's going to be the generation that Dor Shekulo Zakai, the generation of righteous people. Everyone's going to be righteous. We're all going to be observing Torah commandments. Sounds like, wow, an unbelievable thing. It actually never happened in our history. So this is more like saying, it's the fairy tale that has to happen, that has to somehow we got to come to the happy end somehow. It's almost like a dream. The other one is the nightmare. The other one is dystopia. So what's the dystopia? That's a generation shekulo chayav, dor shekulo chayav, a generation that's all unworthy. Terrible, terrible generation. Also sounds a little grotesque, doesn't it? However, if you take a look at a very interesting book written by, it's ascribed to Gaon of Vilna himself and written by his students, his disciples, where he's revealing his mystical teaching, his Kabbalistic understanding of what's happening. It's called Kol HaTor. He proposes something radically different. And in his proposal, it's going to be a very long process. that it's going to start with the nations of the world giving the recognition to our independent state, much like it happened when we came back from the first temple, building the second temple. And, you know, Cyrus gave us that permission. So apparently Balfour Declaration, 1917, we have Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration comes, based on Balfour Declaration, England has the mandate and facilitates. We were not very happy with the British for many reasons. Arabs were even less happy with the British, but the credit is due to where we're supposed to give it. They, at some point, did facilitate creation of many national institutions, and we grew in numbers from about 50-something thousand at the beginning of the mandate to 600 and almost 650,000, which is, by the way, an important number. Think about 600,000. Very symbolic number, right? But I want to go back to Vilna Gaon. That's right. So the Vilna Gaon was saying something very interesting. His scenario of Geulah, of redemption, is radically different to what we've seen in the Talmud. First of all, it's not happening like this as in a miracle. It's going to be a long process of development, which is going to actually have to happen in two different stages. First stage, apparently nothing miraculous is going to happen at that stage, will culminate with us coming and building and establishing ourselves and creating an independent state in our own land in Eretz Israel. And eventually, he's even given us some figures, some dates in that book. And apparently, in the 90s, we approaching the second part of realization of this messianic scenario, which is under the guidance of Mashiach ben David, where we're going to have a journey from us being just a physical entity, which of course the secular state of Israel is, moving from that place of survival mode independence to a place where we can become the blessing for the entire world, to what Israel is meant to be based on the prophecies. And we clearly can see how the Galut vision, very limited survivalist vision of what Israel is about, which was the heritage to a large extent of the generations that were fighting for survival after the Holocaust, and which continued with us agreeing on all sorts of concessions, including territorial concessions to Palestinians as a necessary step, and us coming and agreeing on a two-state solution as a necessary step. All of that was happening until finally, in the 90s, it came to a point of Oslo agreements. And what happened in the 90s, as you remember, after Oslo agreements, basically, Israel got totally disillusioned with this two-state solution proposal because the other side is not interested in making any peace deal. And when you have only one side that's willing to make a peace deal and the other side is not interested, it's certainly not going to happen. So, and that explains how in Israel, basically left-wing political parties are eliminated today. You don't have left-wing political parties. Think of Avodah, which was the ruling force in Israel for years. For years. They were the people who established Israel. Mapai. They were the people who established Israel, were in power until Menachem Begin, the first right-wing government, came into power in the 70s. So what happened to Avodah? Avodah is decimated. It literally is decimated. When did it start? It starts with disillusionment of Israelis with Oslo. And that explains how Bibi and the right is in power for so many years in Israel. And no matter what government Israel is going to have, it's not going to be a left-wing government in any time soon for specifically this reason. But here comes very interesting change. With current Trump administration, first we have a symbolic step of recognition of Jerusalem. But it's not just a symbolic step. It's, of course, a messianic idea. He's appealing to his evangelical support from the right. He maybe is doing this also for his practical reasons. It doesn't matter to us. What important is God the Almighty is the one who runs history, as we know that. What important is it's already part of a new geopolitical reality. American embassy is in Jerusalem. It's not a minor step. As far as the map of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is concerned, as far as our relationship, our understanding of what Jerusalem is concerned, it's a very major accomplishment. And other countries are going to follow. But for other countries to follow, they need to see there is some real change in political climate here. And all of a sudden we see this has been cooking. This has been in a process. And it came right at the time when Trump needs it before elections. Okay, we'll give it to him. What's the big deal? And it came right at the time when Bibi needs it for his political gains as well. Okay, that's fine. But the bottom line question is, what does it do to us, to the Jewish people, to Israel? And I think it does a major deal. Because now we're actually having a total paradigm shift in our relationship with the Arab world. We are not giving up any territories. We are not coming from a position of weakness. We are not coming seeking their friendship because we somehow need recognition in the world. That's how it's happened for all those years of Arab embargo. We're coming from a position of strength. We have been supported by this American administration. And Arab Emirates are our partner. They've been military partners with us for quite some time. And we know Saudis being military partners with us for quite some time. But this is a different thing. This is full-fledged diplomatic relationship between us and the Arabs. Something that is going to change mentality. Something that's going to change the outlook of these people. How they're going to perceive Israel. Their youth are seeing Israel as their enemy. It's going to take some time, but the leadership will eventually take a step to make a difference. And somehow it's going to change. But the most important thing here, of course, is that with the death of a two-state solution, we actually have the real way to make a lasting peace. We actually have an ability to make then Shimon Peres's dream of a new Middle East, which was based on a very wrong premise. It was based on the premise that Palestinians somehow will receive help from the world to establish themselves economically, will give up their desire to undo Israel altogether. That was not to happen, of course. So the new Middle East of Shimon Peres is totally gone. The two-state solution is dead. Now today we can finally say it's absolutely dead. It's not coming back. But what is emerging now from this survivalist mood of a two-state solution, what's emerging now is a very different type of Israel. It's going to be the Israel where Jerusalem is a recognized capital. It's going to be Israel that is going to be seen not as a pariah state and nobody recognizes, half the world doesn't like. Israeli passport becomes much stronger. Israeli economy, Israeli products are going to be all around the Middle East. Israeli startups are going to come there. Israelis are going to, some of them are going to do all sorts of business deals there. And little by little, this change is slow. It's going to take some time, but little by little, this change will become very real. Much like what Gaon of Vilna is saying. It's not the radical scenario of the Talmud where Geulah, Messianic redemption, happens from above, either because we are so good that we deserve it, or because we are so bad that we totally need to be rescued immediately. We live in a world where drastically God is giving us more and more space. We become more and more adults, and Hashem is giving us more and more space for our own action. And that's what we see now. This is the scenario of Vilna Gaon, where the first step takes about 100 plus years until the 90s. And the second step will take another 100 years or so until we're going to see finally what we call Messianic era totally emerging. But we already see very clear signs of a change. It's going to be a very different Middle East if you will be able to drive from Israel through Saudi Arabia to Abu Dhabi and Dubai with your Israeli passport. Very different. And it's already happening today. It's not a dream. It's not a fantasy. It's not something that you're going to tell me, whatever. Maybe in 100 years from now. That's what people would say not so long ago. And yet, im tirtzu ein zo agada. It's not a Zionist dream. If you wish, if you will, it will become a reality. So here we have two pragmatic leaders. We have Bibi and we have Trump. They're both pragmatics. But they certainly have some vision. And of course, Kushner was a great deal maker. And we're having all of a sudden a total paradigm shift in the Middle East. I'd like to take it to the Torah portion and take a look at it from the perspective of the Torah portion. Some people on the right are saying, not a good deal because sovereignty is going to be possibly, the promise of our sovereignty over Judea and Samaria is going to be long shot, put somewhere away for years, who knows? First of all, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I actually think it's the next step and we're not ready for that yet. And it's going to happen. And it's part of the plan. If you take a look how Trump plan is going to be implemented, it's certainly part of the plan. But also let's take a look at what we read as far as guidance from the weekly Torah portion is concerned, what we read in Parshat Re'eh. And you cannot find, I think, better guidance from the Torah than this parsha. It starts with telling us you actually have a choice. It's up to you. I put in front of you two choices. One is called a blessing, and the other one is called a curse. One choice is a blessing, and the other one is a curse. What is the nature of a blessing? The nature of a blessing is we're going to listen to what Hashem is telling us. We're going to pay attention to what's happening today. We're not going to live in the world of our sheens, of our theoretical understanding of how things ought to be, how they're meant to be. And that, of course, was a mistake of the Palestinians throughout that whole lengthy process. They never had any pragmatic leaders. They had in the 30s, they had Rajiv Nashashibi, who, by the way, was married to a French Jew, who was not necessarily an anti-Semitic guy, was not such a bad guy. We could have, if he would have been a leader of Palestinians today, possibly we could have had some deal with a person like that. But then they radicalized. Then they went in the direction of all or nothing. And they were living in the world of their dreams without seeing the reality, without listening to what's happening in the world. But we need to know better. We'll listen to what's happening. We'll leave that path of a blessing. And actually it says, it's interesting, when it speaks about the curse, it says, if you will not listen. But for a blessing, we have almost like a promise that you shall listen. A promise is there, and you will listen. And Rashi here says something even more interesting. Rashi here says, Et bracha asher tishmeu, the blessing that you shall listen, al manat asher tishmeu, so that the blessing is there so that you shall listen. In other words, simple understanding of the text would be that we have been presented with two choices. And the path of the Torah and mitzvot is the path of a blessing. The path of listening to what Hashem is telling us is the path of a blessing. And the opposite is the curse. And that is certainly true. But Rashi here says something else. Rashi here says, it gives us a hint. How are we to follow the path of bracha? The path of bracha, he says, Al mnat asher tishmu, so that you shall listen. Bracha is already there. Bracha is already there. We just need to open our eyes to what's happening today. We need to recognize the miracles in the current reality, in the current world. And if we fail to recognize those miracles, we say, well, that's not good enough. That's not happening. We fail to see Hashem's presence in what's happening today. That's a curse, my friends. That's a curse. That's a path of a curse. I'm saying, well, that's not what it's meant to be. In my book, it's supposed to happen a different way. Take it or leave it. I think we live at the time of fulfillment of great prophecies. And I think we actually, by halakha, by religious law, we are totally obligated to recognize and bless, the reality in which Hashem is giving us, sign after sign after sign with this current very pro-Israeli administration in America. We never had an administration so good for us ever. And with the current development in the Middle East, we're seeing how the world is changing. And something that appeared to us was going to happen maybe in 100 years, all of a sudden becomes a reality today. Talking about peace, I think it's important to understand many people outside of Israel consider right-wingers, somehow politicians are only interested in grabbing some territories. That's, of course, a well-known left caricature of Bibi Netanyahu and people to the right. But it's important to understand that a previous peace deal with Egypt, for instance, Camp David Accords, was signed by a very right-wing person, Menachem Begin. He was fighting with the Brits. He was part of the underground. And he signed a peace deal and he said, there's no greater value for us, the Jewish people, than shalom. And its shalom is going to be a lasting shalom. It's worth it. He made a great concession. He gave up the entire territory of the Sinai for this peace deal, which created a dangerous precedent, in my opinion. And yet, we do have a stable border with Egypt. We can go there, and we have a strategic peace with them. And the first step was accomplished. Now, we are living in a very different world where we don't have to give up the entire territory for peace, because both parties need the peace. Israel is coming out of that galut place where we are being very narrow, where we being very survivalist, where we being almost defeatist, comes to a place where we are a strong, independent country, very confident in ourselves. And at the same time, of course, we need to be aware of how Hashem is present in each and every development that happens to us. I think that's very, very important. So with that, I'd like to finish this presentation, and those with us on Zoom, I'm very happy to answer your questions or maybe some comments that you have, but I'd like to finish this presentation with a blessing that, please God, we shall take every gift that HaKadosh Baruch is sending us with thank you. And that's what it means being a Jew, being able to say thank you. Yehudi literally means thank you, God. And that's exactly what I want to say. And I think we should be very proud of being Yehudi, being able to say thank you for all these gifts that HaKadosh Baruch is given to us, not just as individuals, but as a nation, as our own sovereign, independent state that's only growing stronger and stronger. Thank you very much for listening.